everyone, it's Angela from Cakeangel and welcome to today's Christmas cupcake wreath class. And as you can see, we're going to be using 8 cupcakes and decorating them with buttercream icing, an assortment of sprinkles and a fondant bow. Okay, so let's get going and take a look at all of the supplies that we'll need to make this. So starting from the top left, I have my cornstarch puff, some shortening, 2 varieties of sprinkles. I have my 8 cupcakes, which are vanilla bean cupcakes. I have a small rolling pin with guide rings, my workboard, a wheel cutting tool, tweezers, some edible glue, my red fondant, a Tipless piping bag, a tip 1M, some scissors, and also my green buttercream icing. And the icing is a medium consistency so that it'll nicely hold the shape that we'll be piping on the cupcakes. Okay, so now we're ready to make a start, and the first thing we're going to do is bag up our buttercream icing. So I'm just going to pop the scissors to one side and we're going to use our Tipless piping bag. I'm going to pop my 1M tip inside, so you want to make sure that the narrow end with the points is pointing towards the bottom. Now you can see that because it's a Tipless bag, we need to trim that slightly. So I'm just going to cut a little bit off with my scissors. It's about 1 inch that I've cut off. And you want to make sure that the bag is completely clear of the opening of the tip. This will make sure that the icing doesn't clog it when you start piping. Next thing I'm going to do is grab a mason jar so that my bag can sit in it whilst I fill it, and this will ensure that the icing doesn't go everywhere when you're trying to fill it. It's what I like to call the less messy method, though sometimes you can still make a bit of a mess with it. But I'll show you how to make it as easy as possible. Okay, so I've got my buttercream icing here, just giving it a little bit of a stir. And that's just to make sure that it hasn't started to crust over when it's sat in the mixing bowl. I'm just going to drop some of that in. Now, gravity will do its work for us and it will start to push that towards the bottom of the bag. But you do want to make sure when you do this that you don't overfill your bag, otherwise there is a tendency that the icing will actually come out the wrong end of the bag when you're piping, and that does make a huge mess. So you can use elastics or bag ties to tie off your bag when you are piping as well to stop that happening. I didn't actually have any on hand when I was doing this, so we're just going to wing it for this one. You can see I've got a little bit of icing on the end of the bag there, but what I'm going to do is pull the rest of the bag up and then squeeze it against my spatula, and that wipes off as much of the icing as it can and leave it in the bag. It also keeps the bag a lot cleaner as well. I'm just going to use a paper towel and wipe this off. And then you want to take it out of the mason jar and you're just going to push that icing down. So you see that it squeezes down really easily. Just going to push it down a little bit more. The key is to try and get all of that icing away from the other end of the bag. And I've just given it a bit of a twist and we're going to set it to one side, clean up that little bit of icing that fell on my workboard. And the next thing we're going to do is make the fondant bow. So first of all, we want to warm that fondant up. Fondant is a little bit like icing in that it will start to sort of crust over when it's been sat in the air. So kneading it in your hand will actually just put some warmth back into it. It'll help to make it more stretchy, which makes it easier to work with. So I'm just rolling it around in my hands to warm it through and make it nice and smooth. And because we're going to be rolling this out to make a bow, we do want to get it as smooth as we can. Next, I'm going to take a little bit of shortening and pop some on my board. So this is to prevent it from sticking to the board when I roll it out. Fondant is quite sticky to work with, especially if your kitchen is fairly humid, which mine is at the moment. So I just want to put this down to stop it from sticking. And for this I'm going to use a rolling pin with guide rings. Now guide rings are really handy as they'll actually help you ensure that you roll the same depth of fondant all the time, rather than you trying to do a little bit of guesswork, and it just makes for a cleaner finish to your work when your fondant is the same depth throughout. So there's 2 different rings on here. You can see there's pink and purple. The purple ones will actually give us a slightly thicker depth, so I've just left all of the rings on for this. And what we're going to be doing is cutting several strips to work with. Just going to give it a bit of a smooth over, and I'm going to use my cut-in tool. So this is a really handy little tool. Kind of works like a pizza cutter, but it's much smaller, so you get a much more precise cut, and it doesn't give you any of those furry edges either when you're using it to cut fondant. So you can see it's such a perfectly smooth and clean cut. So this will be our first strip. I'm just going to lay that to one side while I cut more. I'm going to cut this end bit off as well. It's just got a little bit of a ridge in it from the rolling pin guide rings. This one I'm going to cut bigger. This is actually going to be the loops for the bow. So I'm going to pop that to one side. And then we're going to need another strip that will be the center of the bow. So that just needs to be a little bit thinner. Okay, the rest of it I'm just going to roll up. Fondant will start to dry out fairly quickly, so if you roll it back up and then you can put it to one side, wrap it in plastic wrap, and it will store perfectly fine for you. So the first thing I'm going to do is straighten up the edges of the bow. Again, this is going to be the loops. I'm making sure that it's nice and even, and then you simply want to fold the two ends into the middle. And when you do that, make sure you don't compress them. You want to keep that opening on the end of the loops. But what we will do is pinch the center slightly so it gives you that nice little bow look. And we're trying to replicate fabric here, so don't worry if you've got a few little lines in there. It's perfectly acceptable. I'm just going to use a Dresden tool here just to kind of accentuate that opening a little bit more as well. Fondant is slightly heavy, so it will naturally start to compress, so you may just have to come back a few times and redefine those holes. So I'm going to use the thinner end of the Dresden now and just draw a couple of lines. Again, this is to replicate the pleats and folds that you would have in a natural bow that you make from fabric. Just going to give it a press down. Now, because it is quite sticky, I'm going to use a little bit of cornstarch to pop it at the top of my board so that it won't stick any further. And you can see all that definition now on the sides of the bow. It's looking really good. It's a very quick decoration that you can make as well, nice and easy. If you can cut a straight line, you can make bows. So just pinch in the middle again and making sure those ends are nice and open. Next thing I'm going to do is cut that piece that's going to cover the center. So that's going to cover that little join that we have showing. So I just want to tidy up the edges and line it up. Well, that looks a little bit too wide, so I'm just going to trim some more off of it. And then lay it on. And once you're happy with the size of it, you just want to pick it up and fold it over. Now you could use glue at this point if your fondant wasn't very sticky, but because mine is, I don't need any glue. But the glue that I have is just a mixture of water and a little bit of Tipless powder that I've mixed together, and once it's dissolved, it's ready to use. Like I say, I don't think I'm going to need to use this for this bow because it's quite sticky already. So I'm just going to roll those other excess pieces up. And the last thing we need to do is cut the two ribbons at the bottom of the bow next. So I'm just going to quickly grab a piece of parchment paper to pop the bow on. This will make it easier for us to move around and also stop it sticking to anything and help it dry out a little bit as well. So next we're going to cut the ribbons that go at the bottom of the bow. Just want to have a look and see, am I happy with that thickness? I think it looks fine. So you want to cut one end at one angle and the other end at the opposite angle, and then you simply cut down the middle, and that's your two ribbons. And then I'm just going to line them up, make sure I'm happy with them, and of course they'll sit underneath the bow when you do this. So again, just position them, make sure you like the look of it before you leave it to start to dry. I think that looks good. so we can pop that to one side. I'm just going to keep all the pieces separated for now to help them start to dry out a little bit. Fondant will take quite a while to dry out, but it will initially start to crust over just from being in the air. Okay, so I'm going to move everything away. We can start working on our cupcakes next. And as I mentioned earlier, these are my regular vanilla bean cupcakes. They're dairy free. We're going to be piping with the 1M piping tip in our Tipless piping bag, and that's with our medium consistency vanilla buttercream. So I've just got a cake board here. I'm going to position my cupcakes on them to form the circle for the wreath. If you wanted to go smaller, you could just use a smaller board. If you wanted to go bigger, you could use more cupcakes. But we have 4 of us in our household, so I figured 8 is a good number for us, and then we get 2 each at the end. Just a quick show of the 1M tip. It's a star tip, and when you're piping these, we're going to do a big 1M swirl with them. And you can see how quick this is. I'm piping and my tip is raised above the surface. You keep that pressure nice and even and just go around in a circle, and then as you come to the end of that circle, you go in slightly, around again, and then you finish in the middle. This is the easiest swirl that you can pipe. Just always make sure when you do this that you keep your tip above the surface. You want to keep it away from that cupcake, otherwise it will drag through the icing and you won't get such a nice swirl on it. So I'm almost out of icing here. We might just get the last one. Oops, you can see that my icing is pretty much run out. So I'm going to put these to one side and then we're just going to top up our bag. And I'm going to use the mason jar again for this, especially now that the bag has a lot of buttercream inside of it. So again, this is a lot less messy if you put it in something, so you're not trying to wrangle with it in your hands. And I don't need too much, it's just 1 cupcake that's left. And that should be enough. So let's turn up the ends of the bag again. We're going to give the icing a push down and then we're good to go. So let's bring our cupcakes back. And for our last swirl, we're squeezing. Oops, and sometimes that's quite normal that you'll get a little bit of an air bubble when you've added new icing. Don't worry about it, we're just going to pipe straight over it. Okay, so there's our 8 cupcakes done. Now I used a forest green to colour the icing as well, so it's given it a really nice pastel. Next thing I'm going to do is just start adding my sprinkles to them. And I like to use tweezers for this, especially when I'm using buttercream, because it has a tendency to stick to you if you try and put them on yourselves. And these are angled tweezers, which make it much easier to pick up the sprinkles and place them. And it's entirely up to you how many you put on at this stage. The more the merrier, I think, sometimes. And also what colour scheme you decide to use. You'll notice I'm not using traditional Christmas colours for this, but I really like these sprinkles that I have, so I thought they were really cute to use. And we'll of course be adding the bow onto the cupcake right at the end so that it sits on top of anything else that we put on that cupcake first. So the cupcakes would be best enjoyed the same day or the next day, depending on when you bake the cupcakes themselves. I baked these yesterday and so I'm icing them today, so they're still good for a few more days. You can keep them in the fridge if you want to, but just bear in mind that the buttercream will crust over a lot quicker and it will be quite crumbly when you bite into it at that stage. Okay, so that's the snowflakes done. Let's move on to these. I thought these were quite cute. They look almost like Christmas baubles. And I'm just going to use probably 3 on each one, just to add some extra colour. And I find sometimes when you're doing sprinkles, half of the battle is trying to figure out which colour you want to place on which one so that you don't end up with them all on the same cupcake. But there's really no wrong way to do this. You just want to make it look as pretty and festive as you can. This is also a great thing for kids to do as well. They could absolutely help with this. My kids like having a go at the piping, but mostly they just like eating the cupcakes once they're done. So you can see this is coming together really nicely. This would make a really nice dessert over the holidays, a nice centerpiece to put on your table. And like I said, because they last for a few days, there's plenty for everyone to share. You could also freeze these as well. Cupcakes will freeze really well once they're iced. What I would suggest is you pop them in an airtight container and then actually wrap that container in plastic wrap. You do want to make sure that nothing is touching the frosting, and then when you take them out of the freezer, I would suggest that you leave the container wrapped, pop it on the counter, and don't unwrap it until it's come back to room temperature. As I mentioned before, if you pop things in the fridge, fondant and icing tends to sweat a little when it has a temperature change, so you may see some little moisture marks appearing on the buttercream and the fondant when you take it out of the fridge. But other than that, if you store them properly, they'll taste as fresh as the day you made them. Okay, so we're almost done. I'm just going to remove that sprinkle from the top one because we're actually going to put the bow there instead. And because my icing is still really nice and soft, I can just pop the ribbons straight on there. I don't need to use any glue to attach it. And then I'm going to pop the bow on top of that. And look how easy that is, and it's such an effective design as well. So let's clear this away and we can have a closer look at it. So it's nice and colourful, fairly simple to do, and once you can master that swirl with the 1M, these are really easy to do and quick as well. This hasn't taken us very long at all. I really hope you've enjoyed this. I'd love to see yours if you have a go at this, and here's what they look like when they were finished. Don't forget to pop a comment below if you have any questions about this tutorial or any other things that you'd like to know about some of the tools that we've used. And thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed it. Happy holidays!